Hey everybody, Matt Williamson of Pop Goes the 60s back, and this is a part 2 video I'm doing. Part 1 of my best Beatle books was about a month ago, and I chose my top 5 Beatle books, and the ones that were my favorites and I thought were the most essential. And then I also added another 10. So I covered 15 books, and the response was very strong. And a lot of people said, well, hey Matt, what about this book? Have you read this book? This is one you surely shouldn't miss. I thought I really needed to do a volume 2 of this video. So here I am with another stack of my books off my shelves back here. And I'm going to cover all books I hadn't covered in the last video. So one that I didn't cover was Hunter Davies' The Authorized Biography of the Beatles. This came out in 1968. And this is notable because it's one of only 2 authorized biographies of the Beatles. The second one being the anthology that came out way later in 2000. And Hunter Davies was an inside guy with the Beatles. He knew Brian Epstein well. He socialized with the Beatles, and they hired him to write the biography, and this came out in 1968, just prior to Apple and the White Album and that period. So it's still, it's interesting because it came out while the Beatles were still a band. And it's often said that this is a whitewash of sorts. It really isn't. I think this is a pretty good telling of their story. And the only problem is it doesn't go to the end. It would have been interesting to see how Davies would have finished it had he written it in, say, 1970, or had it come out in about 1970 or 71. But anyway, this book is very valuable. It's got one thing I really like. I was going over it over the holidays in preparation for this video. And one thing I had forgotten about was it's got a part in the back called Business Activities. And this goes over where the Beatles' money comes from. Now, I don't ever remember any books ever really talking about this that much, particularly in 1968. So he talks about the Beatles as performers, what they get paid, as composers, when other people record their songs, so radio and television performances, the Beatles as owners of themselves. Very interesting stuff. He even talks about the shares of Northern Songs that they each own. So in early 1968, Paul had 744,000 shares, at approximately 16 shillings per share. John had 644,000 with another 100,000 in trust for his children, children being plural. Ringo and George have 40,000 each, and the profits of Northern Songs in 1967 were 800,000 pounds. So all that stuff is very interesting and makes this book valuable. One of the things that I think it's easy to poke little holes in the quality of his work has to do with a story that's been debunked, and rather easily debunked, and that is the story that John Lennon was born during World War II bombing. That story comes from his interviewing of his Aunt Mimi. And he bought that story hook, line, and sinker, never bothered to check it. Very easily checkable. There were no bombs at all the day that John Lennon was born. So that's one of the things that, with hindsight, we can kind of correct the record. But that's one of the things, just how myths are born. Next book here, Love Me Do, Michael Brun. The reason I want to mention this one closely with Hunter Davies is the fact that this was also written during the time of the Beatles. This is a book by Brun on their 63 tour, maybe into early 64. And this is not a whitewash either. In fact, John Lennon always praised this book, saying it was very realistic. In fact, the NME suggested that of this book that this book was an image killer, and openly wondered if the Beatles would like it. They were figuring the Beatles wouldn't like it. They were wrong about that. But this is a book that's worth reading, a very quick read, but just for its honesty and its lack of whitewashing, I guess you'd say. Okay, let's move over to TheFragrant, Philip Norman with Shout. This book is notorious for canonizing John Lennon and vilifying Paul McCartney. One of the big benefactors monetarily of the death of John Lennon was Philip Norman. This book came out the year after he died, and there was a flood of Beatlemania that happened again after the death of Lennon. And Norman had been working on this for a couple of years, so it wasn't timed for anything in particular. But again, it is known for its treatment of Paul McCartney and how poorly he treats him. And this book was actually reissued or revised twice. This came out in 81, revised in 93, revised in 2003. And you think he corrected any of that ripping on McCartney? Nah, he just doubled down. Let me give you an example here of some typical writing. This is the Let It Be period. This is the George leaving story, and Paul and George fight. At lunchtime on January 10, George said he had had enough. He was tired of being got at by Paul. He was quitting the Beatles, he said. He got into his car and drove home to Esher. Days later, George turned up as usual. Work on the album resumed after Paul promised not to get at George or try to teach him the guitar. So, I mean, this is not true. The compromise to get George back had nothing to do with Paul's treatment of him, and George did not quit because Paul was getting at him. The day that George quit, as many of us know, it followed a fight with John Lennon, and Harrison was having trouble at home with his wife. The wife had walked out on him, and there was stuff going on. So that's all been debunked, and the problem with Norman here, the fatal mistake he made, is he put it in writing, and he will never live it down. Now, in the days of the 80s and even into the 90s, I suppose, the biographies were very light on bibliography. So the citations don't appear next to the actual quote. So you have no idea where these came from. I guess in those days, we were optimistic or naive that journalism still had some integrity. And unfortunately, a lot of these guys can't be counted upon. Another one that came out around the same time, The Love You Make, an insider story. This is Peter Brown's book, co-written with Stephen Gaines. This was the first biography I think I read. So this came out in 93 or 83. I probably had it the next year or so. I got it from the library. I think this is a pretty good book, actually. Peter Brown was a business associate of the Beatles, hired by Brian Epstein. And in the days of forming Apple in the post-Epstein era, where the business was a shambles and somebody had to take over, Peter Brown was a very necessary part of keeping the business running. And he had a lot to do with getting Apple jump-started. However, as I said, the citations are nowhere to be found. And let me just show you a piece of his writing that I think is horseshit. Okay, here it is. This is the White Album era. Ringo contributed hardly at all. He had finally become superfluous to the Beatles. Most of the time he spent in the studio, he sat in the corner playing cards with Neil and Mal. It was a poorly kept secret among Beatle intimates that after Ringo left the studio, Paul would often dub in the drum tracks himself. Now, and when Ringo returned to the studio the next day, he would pretend not to notice it was not his playing. This is ridiculous. Anybody who knows how the Beatles recorded in those days and understand the equipment, know that it's impossible to overdub new drums and wipe away the old drums. The drums were not recorded on its own track so that you could wipe them away. And to have a drummer record on top of existing tracks without drums, that's not how recordings are made. And again, this is one of those myths that there's some of the uber McCartney fans that I think pollute their britches with delight, hearing that Paul is a better drummer than Ringo. This is where some of that emanated from. And again, the myths that get started and put in writing, once they're in writing, it takes a long time to debunk them. Here we have another biography. This is the Bob Spitz book, The Beatles, the biography. This was a national bestseller, 2005. This book is generally regarded pretty well by fans. It's kind of a middle-of-the-road book. There's not a whole lot of bad things to say about it. His writing style, Norman's writing style, which I didn't mention, I was pretty hard on Norman here. But Norman has a very good writing style. He's a fine writer. It's flowing, and he can spin a good yarn. I wouldn't say the same of Spitz. He's got a different style. Spitz's background is that of he's not from the rock intelligentsia, so he wasn't in the buffet lines with the tins of cocaine. He was outside of that, which makes him a little bit of a different perspective on rock critique. And for that, he's got some credibility. Now, one thing that's notable is, again, we're going to go to the Let It Be story of Paul and George's argument. Here he gets it very wrong. He says, on January 10th, there was a tense and hostile morning session during which Paul badgered George about how to play the guitar solo, to play a simple guitar solo. George glared at him, lighting a cigarette, and in the interim, while the anger and frustration building over the past 10 days finally boiled to the surface, look, I'll play over the famous quote. And this is when he said that he left. Later, on a lunch break, the two Beatles squared off in the studio canteen. And then George left. So this is actually 4 days apart. The argument with George happened, between George and Paul happened 4 days before George actually left. The day he left, there was an argument between George and John. So the thing about this book, about Spitz, he gets that wrong. This was written in 2005. There was all kinds of information that would have led him to the right information about telling that story. But that story has become basically a meme of the entire breakup of the Beatles. It's a shame that writers hadn't gotten it right earlier. But, you know, it's interesting. I mean, I think he's a good writer, but it's interesting. There's another spot in here where he actually has a go at this book. Strangely enough, he calls out a quote in this book, a little pointless reference. If it's pointless, I don't know why Spitz would mention it, but you know, these writers, I suppose, get a little bitchy with one another over time. All right, let's move away from the biographies. We've got The Ultimate Beatles Encyclopedia by Bill Harry. Bill Harry is a longtime Beatle insider, friend of theirs in the early days. He's the one that started Mercy Beat newspaper, tight friends with John and Stuart. And this book I got, I can't remember when I got it. I think it came out 1992. And this is pre-internet. So if you took every Beatle entry from Wikipedia and put it in a book, that would kind of be what this is. And at the time, it was extremely valuable. And it talks about all kinds of players in the Beatles world. It has every individual song, places they played, Klaus Vormann, Peter Jones, Jukebox Jury, every kind of entry you can imagine. Every concert hall. So a lot of great stuff in here. And I think this is, I still refer to this book every now and then. So Bill Harry. Okay, the next we've got a controversial writer here, Jeffrey Giuliano. Now I know some of you just recoiled upon hearing the name Giuliano. And let's face it, Giuliano has a reputation. Part of that is due to Jeffrey Giuliano himself. But the fact of the matter is that Giuliano has written a number of Beatle books, I think upwards of 20. This particular one is one I really like, Celebration. It's more of an interview book. Now the reason I want to give Giuliano some time here is because in this book, for example, here's the interviews that he does. He conducts one with Tony Mansfield, Ringo's friend, Peter Brown, Alistair Taylor, Richie York, Ronnie Hawkins, Julian Lennon, Harry Nilsson, Mike McCartney, Neil Innes, Steve Hawley, and Yoko Ono. So the thing that's important to understand, as much as you may not like this guy, leave personality out of it, man. I don't know any of these writers. I don't have anything against them personally. Let's just talk about the writing. The fact of the matter is that lots of writers after Giuliano use his work. They use his quotes and they cite his books. So if they're doing it, I don't know why you would think that's okay, those of you who don't like Giuliano. So again, I think that he needs a little bit of a reassessment. If other writers value his work, then maybe we should value it on some level too. Maybe there's a reassessment that needs to be had. Obviously, he doesn't make that always easy. He's a bit of a prickly guy. And, you know, he's not afraid of telling you so. So anyway, interesting. Moving along here, we have Goldmine. This is the Beatles Digest. These are 2 volumes. And those of you who are familiar with Goldmine magazine, I've been buying Goldmine since I was a teenager. This is what they used to look like, newspaper form. This is from 1987. So I've been collecting this stuff, and I would keep articles, and that's how I started doing my research and building my library. And Goldmine through the years would do all kinds of Beatle exposés and all kinds of articles every year. The Beatles, they always had a couple covers per year, and all those stories were compiled in these 2 books. Let me give you an idea of some of the articles. All different writers. This magazine always had a very good reputation. Still does, I believe. Okay, so there's articles on the Hamburg days, the Merseytown Sound, or I should say the Mersey Motown Sound, I beg your pardon, the making of Yellow Submarine, John Lennon and Yoko Ono appear on the Mike Douglas Show, the Ruddles, John Lennon Remembered, Beatle 45 CDs of the 90s, all kinds of collectible stuff and collectible information. And I was glad to find these, actually. I didn't know these existed, but if you want some good writing and on some specific topics, that will get you there. We have another compilation of sorts, The Beatles 10 Years That Shook the World. This is a Mojo magazine publication. And this started from, there were 3 volumes of magazines they did. So they did 3 versions or 3 eras of the Beatles: 1,000 Days of Beatlemania, 1,000 Days of Psychedelia, which I don't have, and then 1,000 Days of Revolution. And these were very well done, and these were all expanded and made into a book. So I've always liked this book, and it's got all kinds of great photos. It's got the timeline, a lot of great information. So this is one, if you can find it, I'd pick it up. Or the magazines too are pretty cool to have. I don't have that second one though. Maybe I'll find it someday. What else we got here? Oh yeah, 20 years, it was 20 years ago today. Derek Taylor. I really liked this book. This came out in 1987. In the 80s, when I really became a collector as a teenager, I was very happy in the 80s because that was a time period where all the 60s stuff was being reissued and was being re-looked at. And when the Beatles finally released their material on CD, they coincided Sgt. Pepper to be released on CD 20 years ago to the day. So very cute of them, as usual. And this book was written by Derek Taylor to coincide with the documentary that was basically on the Summer of Love and the things surrounding that year and the release of Sgt. Pepper, which was a high point in pop music at the time. Now, I was just going through this. I was trying to pull out some quotes of some of his fine writing, because Derek Taylor's got a good reputation as a fine writer. He ghost wrote George Harrison's I Me Mine and Brian Epstein's Cellar Full of Noise. I didn't find anything just before this shooting to give to you, and what I was finding is a lot of, 20 years after the 60s, how they're talking about how long ago it was, and they over-romanticize the time. Now, after all this time in 2024, we all know it's kind of bullshit, so it's very dated, but I loved it at the time. The Dream Is Over. This is off the record. This is a second volume by Keith Badman. Badman collects tons of interviews, starting from 1970, that go all the way to 2002. And this is very handy. Quotes of the Beatles, there's so many of them, they're so well cataloged. Well, they're not that well cataloged, but these editions of Badman's book do it. And they really help me. And since they're chronological, it's really interesting to read them in order and how they were feeling about the Beatles and their work. Badman also did a book on the Beach Boys as well. It's got a good reputation. Here we got The Beatles Live. This is a Mark Lewison book. And one of the books that I really liked, it tells so much information about how hard they worked. And working bands in those days would have a similar schedule to the Beatles. But the Beatles were the top band in Liverpool for quite a long time. And of course they had a lot of competition as well. They were the top, but there was always people at their heels. And this goes through a lot of those periods, bands that they were playing on the same bill with. There's concert posters here, track listings, or I should say the set listings, rather. So very good stuff here. And if you are a fan of this kind of information, which is very heavy documentation, I would say this book is for you. I'm not getting any product placement for this, by the way. Lennon and McCartney, Together Alone. Kind of an interesting cover. I like this book quite a lot because it really gives a fine critique to their solo period. And much like Carr and Tyler or Schaffner, This is written by John Blaney. I think he has a similar approach where he's not a fanboy, and he really gives excellent accounts and critiques of their work. Let me just read you something very quickly here. This is 1973. He says here, with the issue of Band on the Run just 2 weeks after Lennon's Mind Games, Liverpool's two most famous sons were competing for album sales and chart superiority. As Lennon had a hit single, he should have had the advantage, but McCartney would eventually come out on top. So anyway, he puts things in a very wonderful perspective, like I just read there. I never really thought to compare that album with Mind Games, but sure enough, they came out very close. And sometimes when somebody writes it that way, you think of things a little bit differently. So that is John Blaney. Finally, I want to end here. This is not a Beatle book, but a John Lennon book. The John Lennon Letters. So John Lennon, a prolific reader, prolific writer, prolific letter writer as well. And one of the wonderful things that we have that we can use and find out information on the Beatles are letters they wrote and postcards. In the first video I did, it was I showed you a book, Ringo's book, Postcards from the Boys. So it's always cool to see what they were writing to each other, stuff that was not meant for public consumption. This book goes into a lot of that. It shows the facsimiles of the actual letters. Some of them, as Lennon often did, he had drawings. And one here, I've got a bookmark in here. This is one on, for those of you who have it, page 93. Lyrics on a Postcard. This is an unpublished song, which is, let me just read you the first couple lines. When a girl begins to be a problem, pretty soon the girl must go. When they're gone, you find at last you love them. Pretty soon you want to know. Little girl, I've come to stay, and this time I just have to say I love you. So I don't know, 1965-66 is when that's attributed to. So lots of good stuff in here. Can't recommend it higher. Did I get everything here? I think I did. So that's, I think, another 15 books of books on the Beatles that I think are worth looking at. I know there's been well, a couple thousand books on the Beatles, easily. I'll never read them all. And I keep picking them up here and there, and some really appeal to me. I have more on the shelves back here. Maybe I'll do a volume 3 at some point. But that's it for now. If you have any questions for me, please put them in the comments below. If you have any books you think I should read, put those in the comments below. And if you like the content that I do, there's ways to help support the channel more. My Patreon link is below, and I really appreciate you watching.